Long before kingdoms carved their names across the world, there came an age when Atlantis vanished beneath the ocean and the descendants of Aryas began rising to dominance. It was a savage time, filled with endless conquest and bloodshed. As powerful nations expanded their reach, a terrifying empire emerged from the shadows, the dreaded kingdom of Acheron. Within its dark halls, cruel sorcerers became obsessed with defeating death itself. Using the remains of an ancient king, they forged a sinister mask overflowing with unimaginable evil. Then, through the sacrifice of the king's own daughters, they awakened the terrifying force sleeping inside those bones. The moment the ritual was complete, the mask called forth a dark and unknown entity. Any mortal who wore it gained power beyond human understanding, almost like a living god. Empowered by this evil relic, the Acheron Empire spread across the civilized world, crushing everything in its path. Only the fierce northern barbarian tribes refused to kneel before them. A devastating war followed, and after countless lives were lost, the mask was finally broken apart. With the destruction of the relic, the mighty empire collapsed into ruin. To ensure such darkness would never return, the shattered fragments of the mask were scattered among distant tribes and hidden away through the centuries. Yet whispers of an old prophecy remained, a prophecy claiming that one day a man would reunite the pieces and once again rule the world. Generations later, the Hyborian Age arrived, a brutal era ruled by steel and violence. During one bloody battle, a woman named Phyla went into labor surrounded by chaos and death. Her husband fought desperately nearby while the battlefield raged around them. Realizing there was no time left, he cradled his wounded wife and delivered the child himself with a crude battlefield cesarean. He gently placed the newborn into Phyla's arms as she struggled to hold onto life. With the little strength she had remaining, she whispered a single name for her son before dying in silence. Grief-stricken but proud, the warrior lifted the child high above the battlefield for all to see. That child was Conan. Conan was raised under the guidance of his father, Coran, the respected chief of the Cimmerians. Life among the tribe was harsh, and Coran believed weakness had no place among his people. To harden the younger generation, he organized brutal trials meant to test both courage and discipline. Coran taught that true Cimmerians neither feared death nor foolishly rushed toward it. A warrior needed balance, speed paired with power, aggression controlled by precision. To test the boys, Coran announced a challenge before the tribe. Whoever could run around the frozen hill carrying an egg in their mouth without cracking it would earn the honor of dueling a warrior. The young boys immediately sprinted through the snow, shoving past one another in desperation to win. Among them was the youngest competitor, Conan, who darted through the crowd with relentless determination. But before the challenge could end, danger appeared without warning. Savage raiders suddenly burst from hiding and charged toward the boys. Panic spread instantly. Most of the children fled in terror, desperate to escape with their lives. Conan, however, did the exact opposite. Even at such a young age, he fought with the fury of an untamed animal. While others ran, Conan attacked. When he finally returned to the village carrying the severed head of an enemy warrior, the entire tribe stood frozen in shock. Coran looked into his son's eyes and saw something extraordinary burning inside him. Believing Conan was destined for greatness, Coran decided to forge him a sword with his own hands. As he worked the steel, he explained an important lesson to his son. He said the secret of steel came from the meeting of fire and ice, just as a true warrior required both strength and calmness. Rage alone was useless without control. Afterward, Coran personally trained Conan in sword fighting. Conan possessed incredible passion and aggression, but every duel revealed the same flaw: his anger overwhelmed him. He fought with fire but lacked the cold discipline needed to truly master combat. Frustrated by repeated failures, Conan stormed off alone into the woods to vent his anger. That was when he heard it. In the distance, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the trees. Conan immediately hid himself and watched carefully as a heavily armed army advanced toward Cimmeria. At the front rode Collar Zim, a ruthless warlord driven by obsession and madness. His forces descended upon the village like a storm, slaughtering everyone in their path. Homes were burned, warriors were cut down, and the tribe was thrown into complete chaos. Desperate to find his father, Conan raced through the destruction. Amid the carnage, he spotted Coran being overwhelmed by enemy soldiers. Conan hid nearby, waiting for the right moment to save him. Coran was dragged before Collar Zim and forced onto his knees. Standing proudly before the defeated chief, Collar declared that he was destined to become a god. He boasted that every land would eventually bow before him, and that even the bravest warriors would surrender their loyalty. Coran answered defiantly, telling Collar that whether he claimed to be a god or demon, one day the scattered Cimmerian tribes would unite and destroy him. Collar ignored the warning completely. Instead, he ordered his men to bring forward the ancient mask. It became clear that he had attacked the village searching for the final missing fragment hidden among the Cimmerians. Collar demanded Corin reveal its location, but the chief refused, even while facing death. Unable to watch any longer, Conan charged from hiding and slashed one of Collar's warriors across the face, cutting off his nose. Though Conan fought savagely, he was still only a child. Collar's soldiers quickly overpowered him and dragged him to the ground. Yet instead of killing the boy, Collar seemed impressed by his spirit and determination. Meanwhile, Collar's daughter Marique, a terrifying witch gifted with dark powers, searched the village herself. She eventually discovered the hidden mask fragment inside Corin's blacksmith shop. The moment Collar obtained the final piece, he ordered the entire village burned to ashes. Still, he chose not to kill Conan. Instead, Collar devised something far crueler. Corin's hands were chained high above him while molten metal hung directly overhead, slowly descending toward him. Conan desperately gripped the chains, powerless to stop what was happening. Forced to watch his own father die in agony, Conan felt hatred and vengeance consume him completely. That single moment changed his life forever. After the destruction of his homeland, Conan abandoned everything he once knew and wandered into the brutal corners of the world, carrying only grief, rage, and the burning desire for revenge. After leaving the ashes of Cimmeria behind, Conan wandered across distant seas and lawless lands. He sailed beside pirates, fought among thieves, and survived through endless violence. Yet one thing never changed: the memory of the man who murdered his father. The face of Collar Zim haunted him like a shadow that refused to disappear. Years passed, and the young boy consumed by revenge transformed into a fearsome warrior. Conan eventually joined forces with a loyal companion named Artus. Together, they launched raids against cruel slave settlements, believing no man deserved to live in chains. During one particular assault, Conan intentionally allowed himself to get close to a wanted fugitive connected to the underworld. His actions created enough chaos to draw attention from the slave master Lucius himself. Exactly as Conan planned, he was captured and dragged into a prison cell. Guards informed the prisoners that Lucius was occupied at the moment, though everyone would eventually stand before him. Hearing those words, Conan slowly rose to his feet with a confident grin spreading across his face. The nearby soldiers immediately moved to restrain him, but they stood absolutely no chance. Conan tore through them with brutal force, slaughtering every guard in his path before demanding to know where Lucius was hiding. He stormed deeper into the fortress and eventually found Lucius inside his private chamber. After crushing the remaining guards, Conan strapped Lucius onto one of the torture devices in the room and demanded answers about the man responsible for destroying Cimmeria. Terrified and helpless, Lucius revealed that Collar Zim was no longer a simple raider roaming the wilderness. Over the years, he had become a feared figure whispered about across the lands, a warlord known as the Shadow Lord. Lucius explained that Collar and his daughter, a dangerous sorceress, were searching for a girl born from a pure bloodline. Their next destination would be the monastery of Shapur. Once Conan got the information he needed, he cruelly shoved a metal key into Lucius's mouth. Then he dragged the screaming man outside before the gathered slaves and announced that the key to their freedom was hidden inside Lucius's stomach. The slaves instantly surrounded their oppressor like starving wolves. Among the freed prisoners was a clever thief named Elishan. Grateful for Conan's actions, he told him that if he ever required assistance, he could find him within the thieves' city tied to ancient Acheron. Far away, the monks of Shapur had no idea the danger moving toward them. Inside the monastery lived a young novice named Tamara. Unknown to most people, she was the pureblood descendant Collar desperately sought. The dean of the monastery believed an ancient prophecy surrounded her destiny. She foretold that a warrior would soon appear and guide Tamara back to the land of her birth. Meanwhile, Conan revealed the truth of his mission to Artus. Hearing Collar Zim's name left Artus visibly shaken. He immediately offered to stand beside Conan and help him hunt the Shadow Lord down, but Conan refused the offer. Revenge, in his eyes, was a burden he alone needed to carry. Not long afterward, Collar's army descended upon the Shapur monastery. Panic consumed the sacred grounds as soldiers stormed through the area. Monks and servants fled in terror while chaos erupted everywhere. The monastery's leader ordered Tamara to escape immediately, but she resisted, unwilling to abandon the abbot behind. Soon, Collar's men spotted her and launched a pursuit. From a nearby hillside, Conan noticed a marked carriage racing away from the monastery. Believing Collar himself might be inside, he leaped onto it without hesitation. Instead of finding the warlord, however, he discovered Tamara. As enemy riders closed in around them, Conan mounted his horse and violently cut through the pursuing soldiers. Tamara refused to behave like a helpless captive. During the frantic chase across the rocky valleys, she fought alongside Conan while he eliminated every warrior sent after them. Eventually, Momoa, one of Collar's trusted men, demanded to know Conan's identity. Conan ignored the question and instead reminded him of the slaughter of Cimmeria. He declared that Collar should never have spared the child who witnessed that massacre. Conan swore he would hunt every one of them across the ends of the earth if necessary. Seeing the pure hatred burning in Conan's eyes, Momoa chose to retreat rather than continue the fight. Conan then took Tamara with him and continued tracking Momoa's movements. Along the journey, Tamara spoke about the prophecy mentioned by the dean, though she admitted she understood very little about it herself. She explained that her instructions were simple: travel to Hyrcania and trust fate to guide her path. Conan, however, had no interest in destiny. To him, Tamara was valuable for only one reason: Collar would come searching for her. Back at the ruined monastery, Marique interrogated the surviving nuns using fear and dark magic. She demanded to know where the pureblood girl had escaped to, but none of the women could answer her. During this time, more of Collar's past came to light. His late wife, Maleva, had once been an incredibly powerful sorceress who attempted to dominate the world through forbidden magic. In the end, the Hyborians captured and burned her alive. The monastery dean remained defiant even in defeat. She insisted that Collar would never succeed in conquering the world and declared that darkness would never rise again. Elsewhere, Conan kept both Tamara and Momoa under watch while waiting for Collar to appear. During their tense journey, Tamara confronted Conan directly. She questioned why he had rescued her from death only to treat her like a prisoner afterward. Meanwhile, inside Collar's camp, Marique's jealousy and ambition became increasingly obvious. She desperately wanted to replace her mother at Collar's side and become the sorceress he truly valued. But despite everything, Collar remained emotionally chained to the memory of his dead wife. Conan eventually confirmed through Momoa that Tamara's blood truly was the final key needed to awaken the ancient mask's power. Momoa explained that Collar had spent years searching for a surviving pure-blood descendant. He also revealed that Collar himself would avoid passing through the current route and instead remain near Shapur awaiting word from his men. Using this information, Conan devised a trap. He brought Momoa back toward Shapur and used him to deliver a message directly to Collar in a particularly brutal fashion. Conan demanded a face-to-face exchange within the city. When the appointed day arrived, Collar appeared exactly as promised. He attempted to bargain with Conan, offering riches and rewards in exchange for Tamara. Conan rejected everything. Wealth meant nothing to him. The only thing he wanted was Collar's head. Without warning, Marique unleashed horrifying creatures formed entirely from living sand. The monsters swarmed Conan from every direction, but with Tamara's assistance, he managed to destroy them one by one. Finally, Conan confronted Collar himself. He attacked with everything he had, driven by years of rage and vengeance. But despite his strength, Collar proved overwhelmingly powerful. Conan quickly realized he could not defeat him in direct combat. Thinking fast, Conan signaled Tamara to bring him a torch. The moment she did, he hurled it toward nearby barrels filled with oil. A massive explosion erupted, throwing the battlefield into chaos. Using the confusion to escape, Conan and Tamara fled toward the shoreline, where they discovered a pirate ship waiting nearby. Just in time, Artis arrived to help them escape before Collar's forces could close in. Safe aboard the ship at last, Conan sat inside the cabin and admitted to Artis that he had finally come face to face with the man he had hunted for so many years. Artis looked at Conan after hearing about the encounter and asked whether Collar Zim truly possessed the terrifying power spoken of in legends. Conan answered without hesitation. To him, Collar was not some immortal god or unstoppable monster. He was simply a man, and like any man, he could be killed. Conan swore that he would return one day to finish what had started in Cimmeria. Until then, he hoped Artis would safely escort Tamara to Hyrcania. As the ship continued across the sea, an unexpected bond slowly formed between Conan and Tamara. Beneath Conan's brutal exterior, Tamara began noticing the pain and loneliness buried deep inside him. At the same time, Artis could clearly see that Conan had started caring for her far more than he wanted to admit. But peace never lasted long. Before long, Collar's warriors caught up to the pirate vessel, launching a violent assault across the deck. Steel clashed against steel as Conan, Artis, and Tamara fought together against the attackers. The battle was fierce, but the trio ultimately managed to drive Collar's men back and survive the attack. Afterward, Conan made another difficult decision. Believing revenge was still his burden alone, he chose to continue the journey by himself. Tamara followed after him before he could leave completely. In that brief moment together, the walls between them finally broke, and the two shared a passionate kiss before separating once more. Unfortunately, the reunion was short-lived. While continuing her journey, Tamara was eventually captured by Collar's forces and dragged away. Meanwhile, Conan traveled to the infamous city of thieves known as Acheron. There he reunited with Elishan, the thief whose life he had once helped save. After hearing Conan's plan, Elishan immediately warned him that infiltrating Collar's fortress would be nothing short of suicide. Still, he owed Conan a debt. Out of loyalty and gratitude, he agreed to help him sneak into the heavily fortified stronghold of Kor Kalba. At the fortress itself, Marique prepared Tamara for the coming ritual in a deeply disturbing way. She dressed the terrified girl in the wedding gown once worn by her own mother. Marique coldly informed Tamara that her blood would soon complete the ancient mask and awaken its full power. Soon afterward, Collar himself entered the chamber. Gazing at Tamara, he proclaimed that her death would mark the rebirth of Acheron's glory. He spoke obsessively about resurrecting his dead wife and drowning the entire world in blood beside her. Tamara was then chained onto a massive sacrificial wheel and transported deep into the terrifying Skull Cave, where the ritual would take place. Elsewhere, Conan and Elishan infiltrated the fortress through its underground prison chambers. Inside the dark dungeons, they discovered horrifying cages hanging above deep water, each containing helpless prisoners left to die. Their stealth did not last long. Guards soon spotted them, and one soldier casually yanked a chain, dropping a prisoner's cage directly into the water below. Moments later, a monstrous creature burst upward from the darkness beneath the surface. More guards flooded into the chamber as chaos erupted. Conan and Elishan fought their way through the underground tunnels in a savage battle, barely managing to escape alive. After surviving the dungeons, they learned that Tamara had already been taken away to the Skull Cave. Realizing there was no time left, Conan ordered Elishan to leave while he continued forward alone. By the time Conan reached the cave, the ritual was already underway. Using the very sword that once belonged to Conan's father, Collar cut into Tamara's skin and spilled her pure blood across the ancient mask. Instantly, a terrifying dark force erupted from within the relic. As Collar placed the mask onto his face, overwhelming power surged through his body. He transformed into something far more dangerous than before. At that exact moment, Conan arrived. Without hesitation, he launched himself into a final battle against the newly empowered Collar. The clash shook the entire cavern as the mask's evil energy caused the cave to collapse around them. Huge sections of rock crashed downward, while the sacrificial wheel broke loose and plunged deeper into the cavern before becoming jammed against the rocky walls. Conan and Collar leaped after it, continuing their brutal duel below. While fighting Collar, Conan desperately tried to free Tamara at the same time. Elsewhere inside the collapsing cave system, Tamara fled through the tunnels, while Marique hunted her relentlessly. Using her sorcery, the witch quickly tracked her prey through the darkness. Just as Marique cornered Tamara, Conan arrived in time to intervene. He battled the sorceress head-on and swiftly ended her life. With Marique dead, Conan turned once more toward Collar. The two enemies immediately charged at each other again in a furious final confrontation. During the struggle, Conan reclaimed his father's sword and declared that Collar had never been worthy of wielding it in the first place. As the duel intensified, the entire cavern continued crumbling apart around them. Realizing the cave would soon collapse entirely, Conan seized Tamara and attempted to escape. Behind them, Collar discovered Marique's lifeless body. The sight of his dead daughter pushed him into absolute madness. Consumed by rage and empowered by the ancient spirit within the mask, he pursued them with uncontrollable fury. While crossing a collapsing suspension bridge, disaster nearly struck again. Tamara lost her footing and plunged over the edge. At the last possible moment, Conan grabbed hold of the chain and stopped her from falling to her death. From a distance, Collar spotted them struggling on the bridge and slowly approached. The evil spirit possessing him had grown even stronger, twisting him into something monstrous. Believing herself doomed, Tamara begged Conan to let her go. But Conan refused. The moment forced him to relive the greatest trauma of his childhood, the helplessness he felt while watching his father die. This time, however, he would not fail someone he cared about. Standing on the collapsing bridge, Collar arrogantly declared himself a god once again. Conan answered with pure rage. With a furious roar, he drove his sword deep into the wooden bridge structure and fought with everything he had left. In the end, Conan succeeded in saving Tamara and safely returned her to her homeland. At last, the vengeance that had consumed his entire life was complete. With Collar defeated and his father finally avenged, Conan returned once more to the ruined remains of Cimmeria. There he placed his father's sword back into the cold forge where it had once been created. Only then did the blade truly become his. What exactly is Conan the Barbarian attempting to be? That question lingers over the entire film from its very first frame. Is it a remake of the 1982 Conan the Barbarian starring Arnold Schwarzenegger? Is it a reboot, a reinterpretation, a contemporary adaptation of Robert E. Howard's original pulp mythology? Or is it simply Hollywood attempting to revive a dormant fantasy icon for a modern audience? The film never fully resolves that question, and in many ways, that uncertainty becomes one of its defining weaknesses. Because throughout almost its entire runtime, the 2011 version of Conan exists in conflict with itself. On one side, it is determined to distinguish itself from Schwarzenegger's legendary portrayal. You can feel that intention in Jason Momoa's interpretation of the character. This Conan is leaner, faster, more volatile, more expressive, and considerably more agile. He resembles less of an unstoppable mythic titan and more of a ruthless pulp adventurer pulled directly from classic fantasy illustrations. The film clearly wants audiences to understand this is not Arnold's Conan, yet at the same time, the film remains unable to escape Arnold's legacy. Every clash of steel, every revenge-driven monologue, every destroyed village, every slow-motion battlefield sequence, every moment involving dark sorcery or barbarian philosophy inevitably invites comparison to the 1982 film, whether the movie intends it or not. And that becomes the central identity conflict at the heart of the entire project. Because the original Conan was never remembered solely because Schwarzenegger appeared physically imposing. That film endured because it felt ancient, it felt mythological. It carried the sensation of an unearthed legend from a forgotten civilization brought back to life on screen. There was mystery embedded within that world. Silence carried meaning there. Every frame possessed weight and texture. The 2011 adaptation replaces much of that atmosphere with the energy of a modern blockbuster. Instead of mythic immersion, there is constant motion. Instead of mystery, there is exposition. Instead of ancient dread, there is CGI-driven spectacle. Instead of slow-burning fantasy world-building, there is relentless sensory escalation. And that tonal difference reshapes the entire experience. This movie understands the visual components associated with Conan. The muscles, the swords, the bloodshed, the creatures, the leather armor, the screaming warriors, the dark magic. But it struggles to fully grasp the spirit of Conan itself. The earlier film approached fantasy like mythology. This version often approaches fantasy like manufactured entertainment content. Everything is faster, louder, larger, and more exaggerated. The movie continually pursues scale and intensity, as though uninterrupted action alone can generate epic storytelling. But epic fantasy is never defined purely by size. It is built through atmosphere, emotional resonance, and the feeling that the world existed long before the narrative ever began. That sense of history is what feels absent here. What makes the situation even more fascinating is that some viewers argue the film should not even be evaluated as a direct remake. Technically, it draws more directly from Robert E. Howard's original literary character rather than retelling the precise narrative of the 1982 adaptation. In theory, that creative freedom should have liberated the film. Instead, it leaves the project suspended in an uneasy middle ground, borrowing the imagery and audience expectations associated with the Schwarzenegger era while simultaneously attempting to modernize the character for contemporary fantasy viewers. As a result, the film feels strangely familiar and strangely disconnected at the same time. It is not traditional enough to recapture the primal mythic force that defined classic sword and sorcery cinema, yet it is not inventive enough to meaningfully reinvent Conan for a new era either. And honestly, that identity confusion explains nearly every major issue the film encounters afterward. Because when a movie does not fully understand what it wants to become, the audience can sense that uncertainty. Throughout Conan the Barbarian, you can constantly feel the film searching for a definitive identity it never entirely discovers. At its core, Conan the Barbarian is constructed around one of fantasy storytelling's oldest narrative foundations: revenge. A village is destroyed, a father falls, a child survives, and that child grows into a weapon. That is the emotional framework supporting the entire film. The story begins deep within the unforgiving Hyborian world, where conquest, warfare, and bloodshed are woven into everyday existence. Conan is literally born during battle, entering life surrounded by chaos and survival. From its opening moments, the film wants the audience to understand that this is not a heroic fairy tale. It is a savage world where strength determines survival, and to the film's credit, that initial setup is effective. Conan's father, Corin, immediately brings gravity to the screen. He teaches Conan the Barbarian code, the value of resilience, and the unforgiving realities of the world they inhabit. Those early sequences provide the story with genuine emotional grounding. For a brief period, the film feels focused, dangerous, and mythic. Then the central conflict emerges. The warlord Kalarzim invades Conan's village in search of the final piece of the Mask of Acheron, an ancient supernatural artifact capable of unleashing immense dark power. Zim's mission is driven by obsession, conquest, prophecy, and resurrection. He is not merely pursuing political domination. He seeks something far more absolute, power connected to ancient sorcery itself. And in the middle of that pursuit, Conan's world collapses. His people are massacred. His father is eliminated. His home is erased from existence. From that moment forward, revenge becomes the defining force shaping Conan's identity. Years later, the adult Conan moves through the world as a warrior, pirate, mercenary, and survivor, carrying the trauma of that destruction into every confrontation. The film presents him almost like a force of nature, a man forged entirely through rage, endurance, and survival instinct. On paper, this is precisely the type of narrative foundation Conan's stories excel at: simple, ruthless, direct. The problem is not the premise itself. In fact, the revenge structure is arguably the strongest narrative element in the entire film. The problem lies in everything the screenplay builds around it. Because rather than maintaining a disciplined focus on Conan's emotional journey, the narrative continually expands outward into increasingly elaborate fantasy mythology. Suddenly, the story becomes crowded with ancient bloodlines, chosen descendants, magical relics, dark rituals, prophecies, supernatural abilities, and civilization-threatening stakes. At the center of that mythology is Tamara, a pure-blood descendant connected to the power of Acheron. Once her storyline enters the narrative, the film shifts away from a grounded revenge saga and moves toward a more conventional fantasy quest structure. Conan is no longer simply pursuing the man responsible for destroying his life. He is now protecting a chosen figure while attempting to prevent the return of an ancient evil. And that transition fundamentally alters the film's energy. What initially begins as something deeply personal gradually transforms into familiar fantasy blockbuster territory. The revenge storyline never disappears, but it begins competing with magical artifacts, creature encounters, cult ceremonies, and prophecy-driven spectacle. The emotional focus weakens because the film continually introduces larger fantasy concepts without giving them sufficient depth or atmosphere to feel fully realized. Even Kalarzim's motivations become tangled within this expansion. Initially, he feels like a genuinely threatening conqueror, but as the narrative layers on resurrection motives, mystical ambitions, and supernatural obsession, the character becomes less distinctive rather than more complex. And that becomes the recurring issue with the film's narrative structure. It repeatedly drifts away from its strongest idea, because perhaps the most compelling version of this movie already existed within its opening act: a savage warrior pursuing the man responsible for destroying his family and homeland. That premise is raw, personal, emotionally immediate. But the screenplay continually attempts to elevate the story into a grand fantasy epic without providing those larger mythological ideas, the depth, atmosphere, or emotional weight necessary to make them resonate. As a result, the film becomes divided between two entirely different narratives. One is a brutal revenge saga. The other is a supernatural prophecy adventure built around magical relics and ancient bloodlines, and instead of allowing those two narrative directions to merge organically, the film often feels as though it is abruptly shifting between them. What makes that even more frustrating is the fact that the narrative foundation genuinely had potential. The opening tragedy gives Conan a clear emotional purpose. The Hyborian world already possesses enough danger, brutality, and mythology to sustain the story on its own. And Jason Momoa brings enough physical intensity to convincingly portray Conan as a man shaped by years of rage and survival. But the film continually buries that emotional simplicity beneath layers of fantasy excess. By the final act, the story becomes less about Conan himself and more about preventing yet another familiar world-threatening supernatural catastrophe. The revenge narrative that initially provided the film with its strongest emotional anchor gradually fades into the background, and that is ultimately why the story never fully resonates. Because Conan's greatest stories are rarely about saving the world, they are about enduring it. If there is one central reason Conan the Barbarian never evolves beyond average fantasy spectacle, it comes down to the screenplay. Because beneath all the swords, creatures, bloodshed, and large-scale destruction lies a surprisingly fragile narrative structure. And perhaps the most frustrating aspect is how frequently the film almost discovers stronger ideas before immediately burying them beneath familiar genre conventions. The screenplay wants desperately to feel epic, yet it is assembled almost entirely from some of fantasy cinema's most recognizable formulas: the destroyed village, the revenge-driven protagonist, the tyrannical warlord pursuing ancient power, the mystical artifact, the sacred bloodline, the captured woman, the prophecy, the monsters, the dark ritual, the climactic confrontation to prevent the return of an ancient evil. None of these elements are inherently flawed. Fantasy storytelling has relied on them for generations. The issue is that Conan the Barbarian never transforms those familiar components into something emotionally distinctive or thematically memorable. Instead, it layers them together and relies on spectacle to distract the audience from how routine much of the material ultimately feels. And very quickly, the weaknesses in the writing begin to surface. The dialogue is one of the film's most significant problems. Characters rarely sound like individuals shaped by a harsh and ancient civilization. Instead, they speak like archetypes delivering recycled blockbuster dialogue. Emotional moments are explained too directly. Threats sound overly familiar. Dramatic exchanges often feel assembled from generic fantasy action templates rather than emerging naturally from the world itself. The film clearly aspires to achieve the kind of iconic barbarian philosophy associated with classic Conan storytelling, but many of those lines collapse beneath their own artificial seriousness. And because the writing remains so surface level, the characters themselves never fully emerge as emotionally compelling figures. Conan's motivation is initially effective in its simplicity: vengeance for his father and his people. But beyond anger and physical aggression, the screenplay gives him remarkably little internal depth. The film seems convinced that brutality alone is enough to sustain the character. Kalar Zim suffers even more from underdevelopment. He begins as a genuinely threatening conqueror, but the more the script expands his mystical ambitions, the more conventional he becomes. Instead of evolving into a terrifying mythological presence, he gradually resembles yet another fantasy antagonist pursuing limitless supernatural power. Then, there is Tamara. Her character exposes nearly every structural weakness within the screenplay. At first, she appears genuinely important, a descendant tied directly to ancient sorcery and central to the prophecy surrounding the Mask of Acheron. But almost immediately, the script reduces her into a narrative mechanism. Her decisions frequently feel irrational because the screenplay constantly repositions her according to the needs of the next action sequence rather than the logic of her character. And the romance storyline is where the writing loses almost all emotional credibility. Conan and Tamara develop very little believable chemistry before the film abruptly expects emotional investment from the audience. Their relationship feels inserted into the narrative simply because large-scale fantasy adventures are seemingly expected to include romance, whether it emerges naturally or not. One scene in particular captures the screenplay's broader issue perfectly. Tamara effectively becomes attracted to Conan immediately after he insults her. The film frames this as charismatic barbarian confidence, but in reality it mostly exposes how artificial the character dynamics truly are. Nothing develops organically. Every emotional beat feels mechanically positioned into place. That artificiality extends into the structure of the entire narrative. The story unfolds less like a cohesive adventure and more like a sequence of disconnected levels within a video game. Conan moves from one confrontation to another, one location to the next, one creature encounter after another, without the emotional momentum between those moments ever fully building. Each sequence exists primarily to introduce the next fight. Every obstacle exists mainly to justify another large-scale action set piece. The screenplay repeatedly mistakes movement for storytelling. This becomes especially noticeable in the handling of the supernatural material. The film introduces magic, creatures, sand demons, prophecies, and dark rituals with almost no dramatic build-up. Instead of cultivating mystery or dread, the screenplay simply deploys fantasy concepts whenever the pacing begins to slow. The original Conan the Barbarian understood restraint. Magic felt ancient there, dangerous, unpredictable. In this version, sorcery often functions like another visual effects showcase, and because the screenplay moves through everything so rapidly, none of the mythology is given enough time to acquire genuine weight. Ancient powers appear casually. Civilization-threatening stakes emerge abruptly. Characters deliver prophecy after prophecy without allowing the audience to absorb the world naturally. Even emotionally significant moments are undermined by the writing. The relationship between Conan and his father should function as the emotional center of the film. Coran's death is meant to define Conan's entire existence. Yet after a compelling beginning, the screenplay rarely revisits that trauma in a meaningful emotional way. Revenge becomes Conan's objective, but seldom his burden. And that is the difference between a functional plot and a compelling story. This movie undeniably has a plot. Events happen constantly. People fight, people fall, villages burn, creatures attack, artifacts radiate power, armies collide, but very little of it carries emotional consequence. The screenplay also struggles with tonal inconsistency. At certain moments, the film attempts to operate as dark mythological fantasy. At others, it behaves like an exaggerated popcorn action spectacle filled with oversized violence and disposable one-liners. Then suddenly it shifts toward awkward romance or heightened fantasy horror. The film never fully establishes a consistent voice, and because of that instability, many scenes feel emotionally disconnected from one another. What makes all of this particularly disappointing is the fact that glimpses of a far stronger film remain visible beneath the surface. A focused revenge narrative centered on a warrior shaped by trauma could have been remarkably effective. The Hyborian world already possessed enough atmosphere, brutality, and mythological texture to support that story naturally. But instead of trusting the strength of simplicity, the screenplay continually overcomplicates itself with fantasy excess while simultaneously underdeveloping nearly everything that truly matters. The result is a film that feels strangely hollow despite how much activity fills the screen. There are battles, bloodshed, creatures, magic, prophecies, betrayals, rituals, romantic subplots, massive set pieces, and somehow, despite all of it, very little feels genuinely meaningful. That is the screenplay's real failure, not a lack of events, but a lack of weight. One of the most unusual problems with Conan the Barbarian is that despite the non-stop combat, large-scale battles, monstrous creatures, and relentless motion, the film somehow still becomes exhausting. Not gripping, not immersive, exhausting. And much of that comes down to pacing and structural rhythm. Because structurally, the movie reaches its emotional peak far too early. The opening act is actually surprisingly effective. Young Conan's childhood immediately gives the story energy, momentum, and focus. The film establishes a brutal world, introduces the barbarian code, develops Conan's relationship with his father, and creates a clear emotional fracture through the destruction of his village. There is genuine momentum in those opening sequences. The movie feels dangerous, focused, purposeful. Even the pacing during these early moments feels more disciplined. Events unfold naturally. The violence carries consequence. The tragedy gives the narrative direction. And then, the adult version of Conan arrives. That is where the structure slowly begins to unravel. The film abruptly transforms from a revenge-driven fantasy narrative into a wandering chain of disconnected encounters. Conan moves from one location to another, one battle to the next, one supporting character after another, without the story ever fully settling into a coherent rhythm. The movie is constantly in motion, yet it rarely feels as though it is progressing. And that is the central issue. There is a difference between activity and momentum, and Conan the Barbarian consistently confuses the two. The screenplay continuously introduces new environments, side characters, creatures, and action sequences, but very little of it meaningfully deepens the emotional stakes. Instead of escalation, the audience experiences repetition. A fight sequence, a travel sequence, a capture, an escape. A creature encounter, another battle, another pursuit, another ritual, another confrontation with villains, again and again. Eventually, the movie stops feeling like a cohesive story and begins resembling a checklist of fantasy action obligations. Because the structure lacks narrative discipline, the pacing becomes strangely uneven. Some emotionally important scenes are rushed through in seconds, while other sequences linger far beyond their natural lifespan. The film dedicates enormous amounts of time to spectacle, yet surprisingly little time to developing tension. Characters arrive at destinations too quickly. Relationships form almost instantly. Entire mythologies are explained in hurried exposition. Massive action sequences unfold without significantly altering the emotional trajectory of the story at all. The result creates an unusual sensation where the film feels simultaneously overloaded and emotionally hollow. This becomes especially apparent in the middle portion of the narrative. Once Conan becomes fully entangled in the larger prophecy storyline involving Tamara and the Mask of Acheron, the film loses the simplicity that initially grounded it. Rather than tightening its focus around Conan's revenge journey, the movie continually expands outward. More mythology, more sorcery, more locations, more antagonists, more creatures. But expansion without structure eventually creates exhaustion. The audience begins processing scenes as noise rather than progression. Even the action itself begins to weaken because there is simply too much of it. The film rarely slows down long enough to build anticipation before launching into another confrontation. Violence becomes constant visual texture instead of dramatic payoff, and ironically, that abundance of action makes the movie feel slower. Because endless stimulation without emotional rhythm eventually becomes numbing, the runtime only intensifies the problem. For a story built on such a straightforward premise, the film feels unnecessarily stretched. Conan's journey could have been lean, relentless, and sharply focused, the kind of brutal fantasy adventure that moves with uncompromising efficiency. Instead, the movie frequently wanders. Entire sequences feel more like detours than meaningful narrative progression. The story jumps between ships, taverns, monasteries, forests, fortresses, caves, prisons, rituals, and battlefields so rapidly that the overall structure begins losing coherence. The audience witnesses a great deal but feels remarkably little, and then comes the finale. This is where the pacing completely loses control. Rather than delivering a clean and emotionally satisfying climax, the movie escalates into overwhelming visual excess. The screen becomes saturated with collapsing structures, magical effects, screaming characters, airborne weapons, creatures, fire, bloodshed, and chaos unfolding simultaneously. The issue is not scale. The issue is clarity. The climax becomes so crowded that it loses dramatic focus entirely. Instead of tension, the audience experiences confusion. Instead of excitement, the action devolves into exhausting visual overload. And because the film never properly established the emotional stakes leading into that finale, the climax lacks meaningful payoff. The movie wants those final moments to feel epic, but epic storytelling only works when the structure leading toward it is disciplined and intentional. This structure is neither. It is bloated. That is why many viewers describe the film as feeling considerably longer than it actually is. Technically, the runtime is not excessive by modern blockbuster standards, but pacing is psychological. A well-constructed 2-hour film can feel effortless. A poorly structured one can feel endless. And Conan the Barbarian often feels endless because the narrative keeps moving sideways instead of forward. Even the tonal pacing feels unstable. At one moment, the film wants to function as dark mythological fantasy. Then suddenly, it becomes exaggerated, gore-driven spectacle. Then, awkward romance. Then, supernatural horror. Then, pirate adventure. Then, something resembling a video game boss encounter. The tonal transitions are abrupt, and the film never fully settles into a singular emotional rhythm. Compare that to the original Conan the Barbarian. That movie moved slowly at times, but always with purpose. Every scene contributed to atmosphere, mythology, or character development. The pacing itself created immersion. The world felt ancient because the film allowed moments to breathe. This adaptation seems almost afraid of stillness. It constantly pushes toward larger action, faster movement, louder spectacle, and in doing so, it sacrifices the one thing Conan's stories require most: weight. Because truly epic fantasy is not defined merely by events unfolding on screen. It is defined by making the audience feel the journey unfolding beneath those events. And structurally, Conan the Barbarian never fully achieves that sensation. Ironically, one of the strongest aspects of Conan the Barbarian occurs before Conan even becomes Jason Momoa. Because for a brief stretch near the beginning, the film genuinely feels as though it understands the kind of story it wants to tell. The opening sequences are easily the most focused, atmospheric, and emotionally effective portions of the entire movie. From the very beginning, the film immerses the audience directly into violence. Conan is literally born on a battlefield, delivered through a brutal emergency procedure while war rages around him. It is savage, chaotic, and immediately establishes the tone of the Hyborian world. This is not a polished fantasy kingdom filled with noble heroes and shining castles. This is a civilization built upon bloodshed and survival, and honestly, that opening works remarkably well. It instantly gives the film a harsher identity than many contemporary fantasy blockbusters. There is a rawness to it, a sense that survival itself is inherently violent. For a brief moment, the movie captures the brutal spirit Conan stories require. Then, we meet young Conan, and surprisingly, Leo Howard's performance becomes one of the film's greatest strengths. He portrays Conan as reckless, aggressive, arrogant, and dangerous even as a child. But more importantly, he brings genuine energy to the screen. His interpretation of Conan feels alive. There is rage within him, curiosity within him, and a constant sense that violence is already becoming inseparable from his identity. The film also uses these early sequences to introduce the barbarian code through Conan's father, Corin. Ron Perlman brings genuine weight to those moments. His presence immediately grounds the world. Corin is not presented as a mystical fantasy philosopher. He feels like a hardened survivor raising his son in an unforgiving environment where strength means survival and weakness means extinction. And those scenes matter because they provide the narrative with emotional structure. The relationship between father and son becomes the emotional center of the opening act. Corin teaches Conan about steel, pain, discipline, and what it truly means to become a warrior. For a brief time, the film contains actual thematic substance. It begins developing the idea that Conan is not simply born violent. He is shaped by the brutality of the world surrounding him. And then comes the destruction of the village. This is where the movie briefly reaches its highest emotional intensity. Kalar Zim's assault on the village feels vicious and deeply personal. The violence carries impact. The destruction holds emotional consequence because the film actually invests time establishing Conan's home and his bond with his father beforehand. And that matters. Because later in the movie, many of the action sequences devolve into hollow spectacle. But here, the violence still carries meaning. When Conan watches his world collapse, the audience understands exactly what is being taken from him. Even visually, these opening moments feel considerably stronger than much of what follows. The atmosphere is darker, the pacing is tighter, the storytelling feels cleaner and more deliberate. There is less CGI excess, less chaotic editing, less fantasy overload. The film feels grounded in dirt, steel, fire, and grief, rather than drowning beneath relentless spectacle. And that is precisely why so many viewers identify the first act as the strongest portion of the film. Because it feels focused, the revenge motivation is direct. The emotional stakes are immediately clear. The world still possesses danger and mythological texture. For a brief period, the movie genuinely resembles a proper Conan story. Even the pacing benefits from that structure. The opening takes time to establish Conan's upbringing before launching into larger mythological material. We watch him train, fight, challenge authority, and gradually become shaped by barbarian culture. Those details create immersion. But once the adult version of Conan emerges, the film begins losing that discipline. The transition itself almost feels symbolic. Young Conan's world feels raw, intimate, and emotionally grounded. Adult Conan's world becomes increasingly loud, digital, and chaotic. Suddenly, the film begins replacing emotional storytelling with non-stop action spectacle. And that contrast ultimately damages the remainder of the movie even further because the opening proves the film could have worked. Hidden within those early sequences are glimpses of a far stronger Conan adaptation, a darker film, a harsher film, a more personal revenge saga, one built around trauma, survival, and brutal mythology rather than endless fantasy excess. Even Conan himself feels more compelling during childhood because his anger still feels emotionally connected to genuine loss. Later, the adult Conan often becomes a wandering action figure moving mechanically between battles. But young Conan still feels human beneath the rage. And that emotional connection matters enormously. Because revenge stories only truly resonate when the audience can feel the original wound. The opening act succeeds because it gives Conan something authentic to lose before transforming him into a warrior. Unfortunately, once the narrative moves beyond those early sequences, much of that emotional clarity disappears beneath creatures, prophecies, magical relics, and oversized action set pieces. But for a short period, during those opening moments with young Conan, the film genuinely captures the savage spirit, emotional simplicity, and brutal atmosphere that the rest of the movie spends its runtime pursuing without ever fully reclaiming. Now let's address the single greatest challenge facing Conan the Barbarian from the moment it was first announced: Jason Momoa stepping into a role permanently associated with Arnold Schwarzenegger. That was never going to be an easy position for any actor, because whether audiences consciously admitted it or not, this film was always destined to be judged through comparison, not merely against another performance, but against one of fantasy cinema's most iconic screen presences. And honestly, Momoa enters that impossible situation and delivers considerably more commitment than the film surrounding him arguably deserves. Physically, he absolutely looks like Conan. He is imposing, athletic, intimidating, and entirely believable in combat. But unlike Schwarzenegger's almost statue-like physique, Momoa's interpretation feels leaner, faster, and more animalistic. He moves with agility rather than sheer mass. In battle, he appears dangerous in a fundamentally different way, less like an immovable mythological monument and more like a savage predator. And that distinction is important, because this version of Conan is clearly attempting to move closer to Robert E.D. Howard's original literary creation rather than simply replicating Schwarzenegger's interpretation. Howard's Conan was never defined solely by physical strength. He was cunning, reckless, arrogant, intelligent, unpredictable, and constantly surviving through instinct. Momoa actually captures several of those qualities surprisingly well. His Conan smirks, provokes, taunts enemies, moves with natural confidence, acts impulsively, feels genuinely untamed. There is an energy in his performance that separates him from Schwarzenegger's quieter and more mythological approach. In many scenes, Momoa commits completely to the role's physical brutality. The fight choreography benefits enormously from his athleticism. He moves through combat sequences with speed and aggression, and the film wisely allows him to feel savage rather than overly polished. You believe this is a man who grew up surrounded by violence. And honestly, there are moments where Momoa carries the film almost entirely through sheer physical presence alone. But this is where the larger debate begins. Because Conan is not defined solely through physicality, he is defined through presence. And for many viewers, Momoa never fully commands the screen in the same mythic way Schwarzenegger once did. Arnold's Conan barely required dialogue because he felt larger than life simply standing still. There was something strange and almost symbolic about his presence. Even silence created atmosphere around him. Momoa's version is more expressive, more agile, and more contemporary, but sometimes less iconic. Instead of resembling a legendary barbarian carved directly from ancient mythology, he occasionally feels closer to a modern action protagonist placed inside a fantasy setting, and the screenplay does him absolutely no favors. That is probably the most important thing to understand when discussing Momoa's performance. The film gives him very little dramatic support. Conan spends most of the runtime moving mechanically from one action sequence to another, without sufficient emotional development connecting those moments. The screenplay focuses so aggressively on violence and spectacle that it rarely allows Momoa to explore the deeper emotional layers beneath Conan's rage. The character's trauma, grief, loneliness, and obsession with vengeance all exist conceptually, but the film almost never slows down long enough to let those emotions fully resonate. As a result, Momoa is forced to carry the role primarily through physicality, intensity, confidence, and action performance. And to his credit, he commits completely. Even many critics who dislike the film acknowledge that Momoa genuinely attempts to make the character work. There is effort in the performance. He never appears disengaged. He attacks the role with seriousness and energy even when the surrounding material drifts into generic fantasy spectacle. Some viewers even argue that he is technically a stronger actor than Schwarzenegger was in the original film, and honestly, that is not an unreasonable perspective. Arnold's performance succeeded primarily through presence rather than emotional nuance. Momoa arguably brings more personality, movement, and spontaneity to the role. He speaks more naturally, reacts more dynamically, and occasionally feels more emotionally human. But ironically, becoming more human may also diminish part of Conan's mythic power, because the original film transformed Schwarzenegger into something almost symbolic, a warrior shaped by suffering, silence, and destiny itself. Momoa's Conan feels more grounded, more sarcastic, more modern. For some audiences, that interpretation works. For others, it completely undermines the mythological dimension of the character. Then there is the question of charisma. Some viewers see Momoa as charismatic, arrogant, energetic, and entertaining to watch. Others see constant smirking, exaggerated toughness, or a lack of true screen dominance. That divided response defines the entire performance. But one thing remains undeniable. Momoa understands Conan's physical world better than the screenplay does. He feels completely comfortable inside the brutality of that environment. He fights convincingly, handles the weapons naturally, and moves like someone genuinely raised through violence. Many of the film's strongest action moments work specifically because of his commitment. Even visually, he fits the savage fantasy aesthetic remarkably well. The long hair, scars, armor, oversized weapons, and permanently aggressive posture all contribute to creating a convincing barbarian warrior. In many respects, Jason Momoa was genuinely intelligent casting. The real tragedy is that he was placed inside a film that never fully understood how to use him, because throughout the movie, there are visible glimpses of a stronger interpretation of Conan hidden beneath the chaos. A darker, more dangerous, pulp-inspired version of the character absolutely could have worked with Momoa leading the film. But instead of building mythology, atmosphere, and character depth around him, the movie buries him beneath CGI-heavy battles, weak dialogue, rushed mythology, and relentless spectacle. And that is why the conversation surrounding Jason Momoa's Conan remains so complicated. He is not the catastrophic failure some critics claimed he was, but at the same time, he never receives the opportunity to become truly iconic. He brings strength, energy, violence, commitment, physical credibility. What the film never gives him in return is the mythological storytelling necessary to elevate that performance into something legendary. Because ultimately, Jason Momoa did not fail Conan. The movie failed him. There was one battle Conan the Barbarian was always destined to lose before audiences ever entered a theater, the comparison to Arnold Schwarzenegger. Because regardless of how often people insisted, judge it as its own film, that was never realistically going to happen. Arnold's Conan had already evolved beyond a performance. For an entire generation, that was Conan. The voice, the physique, the silence, the stare, the music, the mythology. It had become part of fantasy cinema history itself. And the 2011 adaptation spends nearly its entire runtime existing beneath that shadow. Now, to be fair, the comparison itself is complicated. Technically, the newer film is not a direct scene-for-scene remake of the 1982 version. It draws more heavily from Robert E.D. Howard's original literary character rather than simply retelling Schwarzenegger's exact narrative. The filmmakers clearly intended to create a different interpretation of Conan. But the moment you place a massive barbarian warrior on screen pursuing revenge inside a sword and sorcery world filled with dark magic and ancient evil, the comparison becomes unavoidable. And, unfortunately for the remake, those comparisons expose almost every weakness in the modern adaptation. The original Conan the Barbarian felt mythological. That word continues to return because it is essential to understanding why the film endured. John Milius directed the 1982 version like an ancient legend carved into stone. Everything carried weight. The pacing, the silence, the landscapes, the rituals, the music, the violence. Even simple scenes felt important because the film allowed atmosphere to exist naturally, and Arnold Schwarzenegger fit perfectly inside that world. Ironically, part of what made Schwarzenegger so effective was what many critics originally viewed as limitations: his sparse dialogue, his accent, his rigid delivery. All of it unintentionally transformed Conan into something less human and more mythological. Arnold did not feel modern. He did not feel relatable. He felt primal, as though he genuinely belonged to another age. Jason Momoa approaches the role from an entirely different direction. His Conan is more agile, expressive, sarcastic, and openly emotional. In many ways, he is arguably closer to Robert E. Sexer, Howard's pulp interpretation of the character. Momoa's Conan taunts enemies, smirks, moves quickly, and behaves more like a savage adventurer than an unstoppable mythological force. And honestly, there are moments where that approach genuinely works. But the problem is that the 2011 film itself lacks the mythological atmosphere necessary to elevate Momoa's interpretation. Schwarzenegger had a film surrounding him that constantly reinforced his legendary presence. Momoa has a film surrounding him that constantly prioritizes spectacle. That difference is enormous. Because Schwarzenegger's Conan was never carried purely by physicality, the entire cinematic language of the film transformed him into an icon. Basil Polidoris' score made him feel legendary. The deliberate pacing gave scenes gravity. The world itself felt ancient, mysterious, and dangerous. The 2011 adaptation replaces much of that with modern blockbuster intensity, faster editing, louder action, heavier CGI, more dialogue, more chaos, more visual overload. As a result, Momoa's Conan often feels smaller, not physically, but mythologically. Then there is the physical comparison itself. Schwarzenegger's physique in the original film was almost surreal. He looked sculpted specifically for fantasy mythology. Even standing still, he dominated the frame with overwhelming presence. He resembled someone forged from steel itself. Momoa is undeniably imposing, but his physicality operates differently. Leaner, faster, more athletic. Some audiences appreciated that because it made Conan feel more practical and savage. Others felt it lacked the overwhelming visual power Schwarzenegger naturally possessed. And once audiences begin making those comparisons, the remake struggles almost everywhere else as well. Stephen Lang gets compared to James Earl Jones. The score gets compared to Basil Polidoris. The villains are measured against Thulsa Doom. The atmosphere gets compared to John Milius's direction. Even the philosophy and dialogue are evaluated against the original film's iconic lines. And unfortunately, the remake rarely wins those comparisons. That does not necessarily mean the 1982 film was flawless. Even many defenders of the original acknowledge that it could occasionally feel awkward, simplistic, or dated. But what it possessed unquestionably was identity. It understood exactly what kind of fantasy story it wanted to become. The remake feels uncertain by comparison. It wants contemporary blockbuster spectacle while simultaneously borrowing the imagery and emotional foundation of the older film. It wants to separate itself from Schwarzenegger's interpretation while constantly reminding audiences of it. And that contradiction ultimately becomes fatal. Because every time the 2011 film invokes familiar Conan imagery, audiences instinctively remember the original executing those same ideas with greater atmosphere, greater confidence, and greater emotional power. Even the violence exposes this difference. The remake contains more bloodshed, more gore, and more graphic dismemberment. Yet the violence in the original film feels heavier because the storytelling surrounding it carried emotional consequence. A single brutal moment in the 1982 film often possesses more dramatic impact than entire action sequences in the remake. That is the distinction between spectacle and mythology. And ultimately, that is why the Schwarzenegger comparison becomes impossible for the 2011 film to escape. Not because Jason Momoa lacked commitment, not because the remake lacked resources, but because the original Conan evolved into something larger than a fantasy action film. It became legendary, and legends are extraordinarily difficult to recreate. If you truly want to understand why Conan the Barbarian never fully succeeds, you have to look beyond the screenplay, beyond the performances, beyond the CGI, and examine the direction itself. Because this entire movie feels like a production being driven by spectacle rather than guided by vision. Marcus Nispel directs Conan the Barbarian with energy, aggression, movement, and noise, but very rarely with purpose. Sequence after sequence feels designed around immediate visual stimulation rather than emotional progression or mythological storytelling, and that ultimately becomes the defining weakness of the entire experience. Now, to be fair, Nispel was never known as a restrained filmmaker. He emerged from the music video world before transitioning into horror remakes such as The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Friday the 13th. His style has consistently leaned towards surface intensity, dark imagery, stylized violence, rapid movement, exaggerated atmosphere, and aggressive visual presentation. You can absolutely feel that background throughout Conan. The film constantly behaves as though it is trying to overwhelm the audience. Every action sequence is louder than the last. Every battle attempts to feel larger. Every magical moment is heightened. Every confrontation is pushed toward visual chaos. But the problem is that Conan was never meant to be defined purely through volume and intensity. It was meant to feel ancient. The movie does not merely embrace brutality. It practically builds its entire identity around it. From the opening scenes, the film makes it clear this will not be a sanitized fantasy adventure. Conan is born during warfare. Villages are destroyed. Prisoners are tortured. Warriors are butchered. The world itself is portrayed as savage, unforgiving, and merciless. And honestly, that commitment to hard-edged violence is one of the film's smartest creative decisions, because a softened, PG-13 version of Conan likely would have felt fundamentally wrong. This character originates from brutal pulp fantasy. His world is built upon survival, conquest, revenge, and raw physical dominance. So when the film leans fully into sword combat, barbaric warfare, torture sequences, and savage hand-to-hand brutality, there are moments where it genuinely captures the harshness Conan's stories require. Some of the action sequences genuinely succeed. Jason Momoa moves through combat with speed and aggression. His Conan fights like a predator, fast, reckless, violent, constantly pressing forward. Unlike the heavier and slower brutality associated with Schwarzenegger's interpretation, this version feels agile and feral. The choreography emphasizes movement and momentum rather than pure physical mass. And visually, the film commits entirely to the carnage. Every sword strike carries physical consequence. Every impact leaves visible damage. Every battle leaves bodies behind. There is a raw physicality to the combat that distinguishes the film from cleaner fantasy adventures. Horses collapse in battle. Prisoners are mutilated. Enemies are torn apart in increasingly elaborate ways. Some sequences drift surprisingly close to horror territory because of how aggressively the film showcases suffering. For audiences seeking pure barbaric spectacle, the movie unquestionably delivers. But this is also where the film creates its own greatest problem: the violence never stops. And eventually, the brutality begins losing all meaning. That is the strange paradox at the center of the film. Initially, the bloodshed feels intense and shocking. But because the movie continuously escalates the gore, the audience gradually becomes desensitized to it. Violence transforms from dramatic impact into visual wallpaper. There is always another decapitation, another throat cut, another severed limb, another spray of CGI blood. And after a certain point, the brutality no longer feels brutal. It simply becomes noise. Because truly effective action sequences are not defined solely by graphic imagery. They are defined by emotional stakes, rhythm, tension, and consequence. The original Conan the Barbarian understood this perfectly. Its violence often felt heavier despite showing far less blood because every confrontation carried emotional consequence. You felt the exhaustion, the struggle, the pain. In the 2011 version, the film frequently mistakes gore for impact. And there is an enormous difference between showing violence and making violence matter. Too often, Conan the Barbarian only accomplishes the first part. The movie also has a habit of forcing action into scenes that never required it. The screenplay continuously introduces creatures, assassins, guards, demons, and random enemy encounters simply to maintain momentum. Instead of carefully building suspense toward major confrontations, the film overwhelms itself with non-stop combat. Eventually, it becomes exhausting. The structure begins feeling less like a story and more like a combat showcase, where Conan advances from one boss encounter to another. And because the action is so relentless, individual battles rarely leave a lasting impression. Even the supernatural combat sequences follow this same pattern. Sand demons emerge abruptly. Tentacled creatures attack without warning. Massive warriors appear one after another. The film continually escalates the scale of physical threats, yet the emotional investment never rises alongside them. Everything becomes larger, very little becomes deeper. And the finale is where this issue reaches complete overload. Rather than delivering a clean and focused climax, the movie throws every possible element into the final confrontation at once. Collapsing environments, magical effects, sword combat, creatures, explosions, bloodshed, screaming, fire, rapid editing, relentless chaos. The result is visually aggressive but emotionally hollow. The audience watches destruction unfold constantly, yet the action becomes increasingly difficult to process emotionally because the film overwhelms itself through excess. And yet, despite all of these issues, many viewers still find the action entertaining. Why? Because the movie commits completely. There is no hesitation, no restraint, no embarrassment about its own excesses. Conan the Barbarian fully embraces barbaric fantasy violence in a way many modern blockbusters deliberately avoid. The film understands that Conan's world should feel dangerous, primal, and savage. Even critics who disliked the movie often acknowledge that the action at least injects energy into the experience, and there are moments where the brutality functions exactly as intended. A savage interrogation, a vicious sword duel, a rapid ambush, a blood-soaked battlefield. Whenever the action becomes simpler and more grounded, the movie occasionally captures the raw physical intensity it is pursuing. But the film repeatedly sabotages itself by constantly trying to become bigger. More blood, more enemies, more effects, more chaos. Until eventually, the violence loses the one quality it desperately required: weight. Because true brutality is not measured by how much blood reaches the screen, it is measured by whether the audience feels the force behind the blade. One of the primary reasons Conan the Barbarian feels so fundamentally different from the original film comes down to one thing: modern fantasy spectacle. This movie was created during that particular era of Hollywood, when nearly every fantasy reboot seemed obligated to become bigger, louder, faster, and more digitally enhanced than anything that came before it. And you can feel that mentality in almost every frame of Conan. The film constantly overwhelms the audience with CGI, visual effects, massive fantasy environments, creatures, explosions, collapsing structures, supernatural chaos, and exaggerated action sequences, as though sheer scale alone is enough to create epic storytelling. Visually, it occasionally works, but most of the time, it overwhelms the film itself. Now, to be fair, the production does not look cheap. There are moments where the visual presentation is genuinely impressive. Certain landscapes are strikingly beautiful. Some fantasy environments appear rich, textured, and atmospheric. A handful of images genuinely resemble moving Frank Frazetta paintings brought to life. At times, the world successfully captures that savage sword and sorcery atmosphere through fog, fire, steel, and ancient ruins. But then the movie begins layering CGI over nearly everything, and that is where the illusion starts to weaken. The original Conan the Barbarian relied heavily on physical environments, practical staging, deliberate pacing, and grounded cinematography. Even when the world became mystical, it still felt tangible. The danger felt physical because the film rarely drowned itself beneath artificial spectacle. The 2011 adaptation moves in the exact opposite direction. This version of Conan wants constant visual stimulation. Digital creatures appear regularly. Sand demons erupt from nowhere. Massive fantasy environments dominate the frame. Action scenes become overloaded with effects. Entire climaxes dissolve into computer-generated chaos. And eventually, the movie stops feeling immersive. It begins feeling manufactured. One of the film's most common criticisms is that it confuses spectacle with atmosphere. Instead of allowing fantasy elements to feel mysterious or ancient, the movie frequently throws them onto the screen abruptly, simply to create another visually aggressive sequence. Take the supernatural material, for example. Magic in Conan should feel dangerous, unnatural, almost forbidden, but here, sorcery often behaves like another special effects showcase. Creatures and mystical powers appear so suddenly and so frequently that they lose impact almost immediately. The sand demon sequence perfectly illustrates this problem. Visually, it is one of the film's more ambitious moments. The creatures are designed to appear unsettling and threatening, and the sequence clearly aims to create a memorable fantasy confrontation. But because the movie introduces them with almost no build-up, the scene feels less like genuine mythological horror and more like a random CGI showcase, and that same issue repeats itself throughout the film. Instead of carefully building mystery and tension, the movie repeatedly jumps directly to visual payoff. Then there is the 3D presentation. The film arrived during Hollywood's post-Avatar obsession with 3D filmmaking, when studios believed nearly every blockbuster required added dimensions, whether the story benefited from them or not. Honestly, the 3D contributes very little. Many viewers barely noticed it beyond occasional depth effects and objects flying toward the screen during action sequences. In some ways, the 3D actually intensifies the film's greatest weakness, visual clutter. Once battles become overloaded with rapid editing, blood effects, CGI creatures, collapsing environments, and magical chaos, adding 3D on top of that only makes certain scenes feel even more crowded. And crowded ultimately becomes the defining visual identity of the movie. The film rarely trusts simplicity. Every set piece must become larger. Every environment must feel grander. Every battle must escalate further. The result is fantasy spectacle without visual discipline. Compare that to the original Conan. The earlier film understood restraint. It understood when silence was enough. It understood when landscapes alone could create atmosphere. It understood when stillness carried more power than movement. The remake constantly behaves as though it fears losing the audience's attention for even a few seconds. So it keeps adding more to the frame, more effects, more movement, more creatures, more destruction, more digital enhancement. But ironically, the more the film escalates visually, the less memorable many scenes become. Because memorable fantasy imagery is not created through quantity, it is created through identity. And that is something the remake struggles to maintain throughout nearly its entire runtime. Many action sequences blur together because the visual style devolves into repetitive chaos. The audience remembers that an enormous amount happened, but not necessarily what happened. Even the climax suffers from this issue. The finale becomes such an overwhelming combination of fire, bloodshed, creatures, magical effects, collapsing structures, screaming characters, and rapid editing that the emotional focus disappears completely. Instead of feeling epic, the ending eventually becomes exhausting. The movie wants grandeur, but grandeur without clarity eventually becomes noise. That does not mean the visual effects are entirely unsuccessful. For 2011, some of the CGI remains reasonably serviceable. Certain environments and creature designs still hold up surprisingly well. And there are moments where the film's commitment to dark fantasy spectacle genuinely creates striking imagery. But the over-reliance on digital enhancement continually pulls the movie away from the raw, barbaric atmosphere it is trying to create. Conan works best when the world feels physical, dirty, heavy, tangible. The remake often feels too polished, too digitally enhanced, too obsessed with visual excess, and that ultimately defines the film's entire approach to spectacle. It believes epic fantasy is created through larger effects and louder visuals. But true fantasy immersion comes from convincing the audience that the world exists even when nothing is exploding. The original film understood that instinctively. This one keeps trying to replace it with CGI chaos. If there is one area where Conan the Barbarian consistently earns genuine admiration, even from viewers who dislike the film overall, it is the production design and visual presentation. Because regardless of the movie's many problems, it rarely appears inexpensive. In fact, there are moments where Conan 2011 looks exactly like the kind of savage fantasy epic audiences hoped modern sword and sorcery cinema could become. The world itself often feels rich with physical texture and detail. The armor appears heavy and battle-worn. The swords look brutal. The villages feel harsh and unforgiving. The ships feel massive. The environments feel ancient, hostile, and lived in. And that physical texture matters enormously. Because Conan's universe should never feel elegant or polished. It should feel rough, violent, dirty, and shaped through survival. This is a world forged through conquest, warfare, endurance, and bloodshed. And visually, the film understands that reality far better than it understands its own storytelling. The locations themselves carry much of the film's atmosphere. Shooting in Bulgaria and Malta gives the movie natural landscapes that immediately create scale and mood. Forests, cliffs, fog-covered valleys, ruined fortresses, rocky coastlines, and enormous open terrain all help establish a convincing fantasy environment. Even when the screenplay weakens, the scenery continues trying to persuade the audience that this world exists beyond the characters moving through it. And honestly, some individual shots are genuinely beautiful. There are moments where the movie almost resembles moving fantasy artwork. You can clearly feel the influence of classic Frank Frazetta paintings within the visual design. Enormous warriors, dark skies, glowing firelight, oversized weapons, grim fortresses, and barbaric silhouettes standing against hostile landscapes. Those are the moments where the film comes closest to capturing the savage fantasy identity it is desperately pursuing. The costume design also deserves substantial credit. Conan himself looks convincing throughout most of the film. His armor, cloaks, scars, weapons, and overall appearance fit naturally within the brutal world surrounding him. The film wisely avoids making him feel overly polished or superhero-like. Instead, he genuinely resembles someone who has survived years of violence and warfare. That same attention to visual detail extends to many supporting characters as well. The antagonists wear intimidating dark armor that instantly separates them visually from Conan's barbarian environment. Marik's unusual costumes and metal finger blades create one of the movie's most memorable visual identities. The various warriors, tribes, mercenaries, monks, and soldiers all possess distinct appearances that help flesh out the fantasy setting. Even smaller details stand out. Engraved weapons, battle-damaged shields, ritual masks, barbarian helmets, ancient temples, enormous ships dragged across landscapes. There is genuine effort visible in the visual construction of this world. One element repeatedly praised by viewers is the ship design itself. The massive land-traveling vessel used by Kalarzim's forces gives the movie a strange fantasy identity that actually feels unique at times. It is visually absurd, yet undeniably memorable. Exactly the kind of exaggerated imagery that sword and sorcery storytelling often thrives upon. Then there is the atmosphere. The cinematography frequently bathes the film in fog, smoke, dusk lighting, and muted earth tones. Many scenes appear trapped somewhere between sunset and darkness, creating an almost permanent twilight atmosphere across the world. That visual choice gives the film a grim, oppressive texture that works surprisingly well within Conan's universe. At certain moments, the movie genuinely looks mythological, and that matters, because even critics who strongly disliked the screenplay or direction often admitted that the visual side of the production demonstrated ambition. The sets are large, the costumes are detailed, the environments feel expensive. The production clearly invested heavily in creating a fully realized fantasy world. And honestly, compared to many contemporary fantasy films that rely almost entirely on green screen environments, Conan at least attempts to build physical spaces with texture, weight, and scale. But here is the real tragedy. The production design is often stronger than the movie itself. That is what makes the visual presentation so frustrating. The world frequently looks like it belongs to a much better film. You can see glimpses of an extraordinary Conan adaptation hidden inside the scenery, the armor, the lighting, and the landscapes. There are moments where the movie feels only a few creative decisions away from becoming a genuinely memorable dark fantasy epic. But the storytelling never rises to the same level as the visuals. The film creates impressive environments, then fills them with generic dialogue. It builds mythological-looking landscapes, then rushes through them with chaotic pacing. It designs memorable costumes and weapons, then buries them beneath CGI overload and repetitive action sequences. The visual artistry constantly struggles against the screenplay's lack of emotional depth, and nowhere is this contrast clearer than when comparing the movie to the original Conan the Barbarian. The earlier film had a smaller budget, simpler effects, and far less technological capability. Yet its visual identity became iconic because every artistic element supported the mythological tone of the story. The 2011 version possesses more money, larger environments, and more advanced effects, yet often feels emotionally emptier despite all that scale. Still, credit absolutely belongs where it is deserved. The production team clearly understood the aesthetic language of Conan: the leather, the steel, the fire, the fog, the barbarian armor, the ancient ruins, the brutal landscapes. Visually, the film often succeeds in creating a harsh fantasy world worthy of the character. It is simply unfortunate that the screenplay and direction rarely provide that world with the emotional depth it deserves. One thing Conan the Barbarian genuinely understands, at least visually, is that Conan's universe should never feel bright, clean, or welcoming. This is not heroic fantasy. This is a world of steel, mud, blood, fire, smoke, and death. And the cinematography spends almost the entire film attempting to trap the audience inside that atmosphere. In many ways, the visual mood becomes one of the movie's strongest qualities. There is a constant sense of darkness hanging over the world. Not literal darkness where nothing can be seen, but a heavy and oppressive visual tone. The film often looks as though it exists in a permanent state between sunset and nightfall. Fog drifts through forests. Firelight flickers across armor. Dust fills the air during battles. Entire landscapes feel submerged beneath gray skies and dying sunlight. And honestly, whenever the movie slows down long enough to allow those visuals room to breathe, it can look genuinely stunning. There are shots throughout the film that truly feel mythological. Massive warriors silhouetted against burning villages, Conan standing alone against brutal landscapes, ancient ruins disappearing into fog, black armored riders emerging through smoke. At times, the cinematography almost creates the atmosphere the screenplay continually struggles to achieve. That is the fascinating contradiction at the center of the movie. Visually, it occasionally feels ancient. Emotionally, it often feels modern and hollow. The cinematography constantly attempts to create mood through texture and lighting. Many scenes are intentionally desaturated, dominated by earthy browns, steel grays, dark reds, and cold blue shadows. The visual palette avoids bright fantasy colors and instead leans heavily into grim realism mixed with pulp fantasy imagery. This approach works especially well during the opening act. Young Conan's world feels harsh and primal. The environments possess genuine weight. The lighting creates tension naturally. Villages feel cold and dangerous rather than theatrical. Firelight and smoke make the world feel inhabited and worn down by violence. And because the pacing remains more disciplined early on, the atmosphere actually has time to settle into the audience. That is important. Atmosphere cannot exist when a film is constantly sprinting forward. It requires space, and whenever Conan the Barbarian pauses its relentless action long enough, the cinematography begins carrying significant emotional weight for the film. The landscapes start communicating story visually. The fog-covered environments create mystery. The ruined structures suggest forgotten civilizations and ancient histories. For brief moments, the world finally feels old enough to contain mythology. Some shots even resemble dark fantasy paintings brought to life. You can clearly feel the influence of classic sword and sorcery artwork in the framing of certain compositions: towering warriors, oversized weapons, glowing firelight, endless dusk, silhouettes standing against ruined landscapes. Those moments are probably the closest the film ever comes to capturing authentic Conan atmosphere, but the movie repeatedly undermines itself. Because while the cinematography works to create mood, the direction and editing constantly interrupt it. The film rarely allows scenes to breathe naturally before cutting into another action sequence, another CGI-heavy moment, or another burst of spectacle. So even though the visual atmosphere is often strong, the emotional atmosphere never fully settles into place. This becomes especially obvious when comparing the film to the original Conan the Barbarian. The earlier movie used cinematography to create mythology itself. Its landscapes felt ancient and sacred. The stillness within certain scenes gave the world mystery. Silence became part of the atmosphere. The camera lingered on environments long enough for audiences to absorb the scale, loneliness, and danger of Conan's world. The remake is far more restless. The camera moves constantly. The action escalates constantly. The editing pushes urgency constantly. As a result, the atmosphere becomes fragmented. The visuals are present, but the immersion keeps getting interrupted. And yet, genuine credit belongs to the cinematography team because there are sequences where the film becomes visually powerful despite its narrative weaknesses. The battlefield sequences often feel brutal and smoke-covered. The forests feel threatening. The villages feel primitive. The temples feel ancient. Even portions of the sea travel imagery create a convincing fantasy atmosphere. The movie clearly wanted to construct a darker, moodier version of Conan's universe compared to many cleaner modern fantasy blockbusters. And for portions of the runtime, it genuinely succeeds. The lighting design especially deserves recognition. The film constantly uses shadows, dusk tones, firelight, and fog to create a grim fantasy mood. Many scenes appear trapped in permanent twilight, giving the world a cursed, dreamlike quality. That visual identity helps separate Conan from the brighter fantasy films of its era. But once again, atmosphere alone cannot sustain a film indefinitely. Eventually, the audience needs emotional connection beneath the imagery, and that is where the cinematography reaches its limit. The movie looks mythological at times, but it rarely feels mythological. The visuals create the outer shell of a legendary fantasy world, while the screenplay and pacing continually undermine the emotional depth necessary to complete the illusion. Still, whenever audiences praise Conan the Barbarian, they almost always return to the same elements: the mood, the landscapes, the fog, the lighting, the gritty fantasy aesthetic. Because visually, the movie often comes dangerously close to greatness. It simply never fully learns how to sustain it. A Conan film ultimately lives or dies through atmosphere. And atmosphere in fantasy cinema is not built solely through visuals, it is built through music. That is why the soundtrack becomes such a major point of discussion whenever people talk about Conan the Barbarian. The original film achieved that almost effortlessly. The remake, by comparison, mostly delivers functional fantasy accompaniment, and that is ultimately why the soundtrack remains so divisive. Some viewers hear a respectable attempt at old-school epic fantasy composition. Others hear a forgettable blockbuster score trapped beneath the shadow of a legendary predecessor it could never realistically escape. But almost everyone agrees on one thing: following Basil Polidorus was probably an unwinnable challenge from the very beginning. Every great Conan story requires a villain powerful enough to feel like the embodiment of darkness itself, not merely physically dangerous, but mythological, terrifying, obsessive, larger than life. And in Conan the Barbarian, that responsibility falls on Kalarzim. The problem is that Kalarzim never fully becomes the antagonist this movie desperately needs him to be. Now, on paper, the setup sounds promising. Zim is introduced as a ruthless warlord driven by obsession. He searches for the Mask of Acheron, an ancient artifact tied to supernatural power and resurrection. He destroys villages, eliminates entire tribes, commands armies, and pursues forbidden sorcery with absolute determination. This is a man willing to burn civilizations to the ground in pursuit of godlike power, and Stephen Lang certainly appears capable of portraying that kind of figure. He possesses the voice, the intensity, the hardened physical presence, and the disciplined authority necessary for a dark fantasy conqueror. There are moments where Lang genuinely feels dangerous. During the assault on Conan's village, his controlled cruelty gives the opening act real tension. For a brief period, Kalarzim feels like a legitimate threat, a conqueror shaped by brutality and obsession. But the deeper the film progresses, the weaker the character becomes, and most of that deterioration comes directly from the screenplay. Because the script never develops Zim beyond generic fantasy motivations. He wants power, he wants resurrection, he wants the ancient mask restored, he wants domination. But the film rarely explores who he actually is beneath those ambitions. There is no mystery surrounding him, no mythology attached to him, no hypnotic screen presence. He functions mechanically, and for a Conan villain, that is fatal. Because audiences were always going to compare him to one of fantasy cinema's greatest antagonists, Thulsa Doom, and that comparison completely overwhelms Kalarzim. James Earl Jones's Thulsa Doom was not simply a villain. He felt supernatural even before the story fully embraced sorcery. He spoke calmly, slowly, philosophically. There was intelligence, sadness, and corruption beneath the menace. He did not require constant screaming or endless violence to dominate scenes. He felt like a cult leader capable of spiritually corrupting entire civilizations. Kalarzim, by contrast, often resembles a standard fantasy warlord from a modern CGI-driven blockbuster. And that is the difference. Thulsa Doom felt legendary. Kalarzim feels written. Once you recognize that distinction, the illusion begins to collapse. The film attempts to compensate by continually increasing Zim's scale: larger armies, bigger set pieces, darker rituals, ancient artifacts, monstrous environments, endless destruction. But scale is not the same as presence. A villain becomes memorable through atmosphere and identity, not simply through the number of soldiers surrounding him. Even visually, the movie struggles to define Zim beyond the image of a generic dark fantasy conqueror. His armor appears intimidating, his armies appear threatening, His environments are enormous and grim, but emotionally, he never leaves the impact the film clearly wants him to achieve. The revenge connection with Conan should have solved much of this problem. After all, Zim eliminates Conan's father and destroys his entire village. That should create one of the most emotionally charged rivalries in the story. But surprisingly, the relationship between hero and antagonist remains underdeveloped for most of the runtime. Conan hates him intensely. Zim barely appears personally invested in Conan at all. That imbalance weakens the narrative considerably. Great revenge stories work when both sides feel emotionally connected to the conflict. Here, Zim frequently treats Conan more like an obstacle than a true opposing force. As a result, their rivalry never develops the mythological emotional weight it desperately needs. Then the supernatural storyline weakens the villain even further. The more the movie focuses on magical artifacts, resurrection rituals, prophecies, and ancient bloodlines, the less grounded and threatening Zim becomes. Instead of remaining a terrifying human conqueror consumed by obsession, he gradually transforms into another conventional fantasy antagonist, chasing apocalyptic supernatural power. Others criticize Marcus Nispel's direction as visually aggressive but emotionally disconnected. Many viewers felt the movie drowned itself in gore and spectacle, while forgetting to create meaningful characters or mythological atmosphere. And perhaps the most devastating criticism repeated throughout the reviews is this: the film constantly reminds audiences of stronger fantasy movies. Whether through direct comparison to the original Conan or through similarities to other fantasy franchises, the movie rarely feels distinctive enough to stand entirely on its own. Instead of defining a new era for Conan, it often feels like it is chasing trends created by other films. That criticism appears repeatedly, but interestingly, even many negative reviews still acknowledge certain strengths. Very few people argue the movie is completely incompetent. Instead, they describe it as frustrating, because visually, the film often succeeds. The production design impresses viewers. The brutality creates momentum. The fantasy atmosphere occasionally works. Some audiences even argue that Jason Momoa deserved a much stronger movie surrounding him, and that observation matters, because the film's defenders are usually not claiming it is a masterpiece either. Most positive reactions describe Conan as entertaining, visually ambitious, violent, old school, and enjoyable once expectations are adjusted appropriately. That is a very different type of praise. Supporters of the film often admit the story is weak. They admit the dialogue relies heavily on cliches. They admit the pacing becomes messy. They admit the movie never reaches the mythological power of the original. But they still enjoy the experience because the film commits completely to savage fantasy spectacle. And honestly, that split reaction perfectly defines the movie's legacy. Conan the Barbarian became one of those films. Audiences debate less in terms of objective quality and more in terms of expectation. If someone expected a mythological fantasy epic, a worthy successor to John Milius's Conan, a deep adaptation of Robert E. Daptation, Howard's World, or a genre-defining revival, they were usually disappointed. But if someone wanted bloody sword fights, monsters, revenge, dark fantasy imagery, violent barbarian action, and a straightforward old-school fantasy adventure, they often found enough entertainment to enjoy the experience. That is why the movie survives primarily as a divisive cult fantasy, rather than a universally beloved classic or a universally ridiculed failure. And Jason Momoa remains directly at the center of that divide. Some viewers believed he lacked Schwarzenegger's mythological screen presence. Others argued he actually captured Howard's original Conan more faithfully. Some found him charismatic, others found him emotionally flat. But almost everyone agreed on one thing: he committed fully to the physical demands of the role. In fact, many reviews ultimately conclude that Momoa himself was never the film's true problem. The larger issue was everything surrounding him: the writing, the structure, the tonal confusion, the lack of mythic atmosphere, and the obsession with spectacle over substance. And that becomes the final consensus running through nearly every review. Conan the Barbarian is a movie overflowing with effort, violence, production scale, and fantasy ambition, while lacking the deeper storytelling identity necessary to become unforgettable. It is too loud to become mythic, too modern to feel timeless, too chaotic to feel emotionally powerful. And perhaps most importantly of all, it never escapes the shadow of the original film. Because no matter how much blood covers the battlefield, no matter how enormous the conflicts become, no matter how many monsters, visual effects and fantasy spectacles the film unleashes across the screen, Conan the Barbarian never fully achieves the one thing audiences were truly hoping for from a Conan revival: mythic permanence. That is ultimately the defining absence at the center of the entire movie. The film delivers movement, aggression, scale, brutality, and constant sensory intensity. It recreates the surface language of barbarian fantasy with absolute commitment. Swords clash endlessly. Ancient temples collapse. Dark sorcery erupts across the screen. Warriors charge through fire and smoke while blood stains every battlefield. And yet, despite all that spectacle, the movie rarely feels timeless. Because true fantasy legend is not created through excess alone. It is created through atmosphere, emotional gravity, identity, and the feeling that the story belongs to something older and larger than itself. That is what the original Conan the Barbarian understood so instinctively. It did not merely present a fantasy world. It made audiences feel as though they were witnessing fragments of a forgotten mythology pulled from another age. The landscapes felt ancient. The silence carried meaning. The violence carried consequence. Even stillness became part of the storytelling. The 2011 adaptation constantly searches for that same mythological power, but rarely slows down long enough to truly find it. Instead, the movie pushes harder and harder toward modern blockbuster escalation. More combat, more movement, more effects, more destruction. The spectacle keeps expanding, but the emotional resonance underneath it never grows at the same pace, and that imbalance becomes fatal, because audiences can forgive imperfections. They can forgive uneven pacing, flawed dialogue, or excessive ambition if a film leaves behind unforgettable feeling, if it creates moments that linger in memory long after the credits end. But Conan the Barbarian rarely leaves behind that kind of emotional imprint. It entertains, occasionally impresses, sometimes even hints at greatness, but it never fully transforms into legend, and that may be the most revealing conclusion of all. The movie spends its entire runtime trying to convince audiences that Conan is larger than life, a savage force moving through mythological chaos. But the film surrounding him never becomes equally mythic. It remains trapped between homage and reinvention, between pulp fantasy and blockbuster spectacle, between ancient atmosphere and modern excess. There are flashes where you can see the stronger film hidden underneath everything: a darker Conan, a harsher Conan, a more atmospheric Conan, a version rooted in primal loneliness, brutal mythology, and emotional weight rather than non-stop escalation. But those flashes never fully unite into something enduring, and so the film ultimately becomes a fascinating contradiction, a movie overflowing with ambition, violence, fantasy imagery, and production scale, yet somehow still unable to leave the lasting cultural impact its creators clearly wanted. Because in the end, Conan was never supposed to be remembered merely for spectacle. Conan was supposed to feel eternal.